Back when my mom was in her late teens and early 20s, she did a lot of hitchhiking. I think this was super popular among young people in the 1960s and 1970s. At the time wasn't yet considered dangerous, really. And she did it for a few years. But because we live up here in the Northeast, it's not a great idea to engage in anything outdoorsy, hitchhiking included, until about early to mid-spring. So this one year, Mom sets out at around Easter weekend. Just as the good weather arrives, she met an older man at a gas station and asked him if he can take her along to the next bigger town. She didn't really want to ask him because he gave off some strange vibes. But it was late in the evening, and the gas station was out in the middle of the sticks. She couldn't just stay there. So she told herself, "I'm sure it's going to be fine." When she wanted to get in the passenger seat, the man told her that she had to sit in the back. She asked him why, but he wouldn't give her a clear answer. Just kept insisting that she had to sit in the back. We began to drive, and it was mostly uneventful. My mom tried to do some small talk with the man, but he'd only give her very short answers. She thought maybe he's tired, so she just stopped trying to engage with him. Finally, they reached the town where my mom wanted to go. She told the guy to pull over at a specific location. When they reached the location, he simply drove past, didn't even slow down. My mom got really confused and asked him to pull over at the next crossroad. But once again, he simply continued driving. She asked him what he's doing. He didn't respond. Instead, he pushed down the central lock, which locked all 4 doors. Luckily, my mom is a very confident person. And if she wants to, she can be very scary as well. She told me, quote, "For a few seconds, I panic. But then I said to the guy in a calm and very stern voice, 'Stop the car right now and let me out.' The guy didn't react. So she said it one more time. 'Right now.' Apparently he got scared because he pulled over and unlocked the door. He didn't say a single word. She got out, and once she was out, she ran away. And to say that I'm glad she got away would be an understatement. And it's weird to think that if that whole encounter hadn't gone her way, I don't think I would even be around to write this. This might not seem so frightening to some, but to me and my wife, it's one of the most unsettling things that's ever happened to us. So I happen to be married to a commercial pilot and often pick her up from the airport after particularly long flights. This happened back when we're still dating at around 9 p.m. on Easter Sunday, of all days. We were heading home from the airport when the road took us by a pull-off where some country dumpsters were on one side of the road. As we drove by a blacked-out car that had been parked, spun out of the gravel, and got right behind me doing the speed limit. I mean, he was so close in the rear view that I could only see the tint on his windshield, not even his car's hood. It wasn't a cop car. It was an early 2000 Chevy. And it was following us. I took some random turns using my blinker thinking that he was just going the same way as me and wanted me to hurry up on the one-lane road with a double yellow. But after 3 random turns that kept up in the same area, I realized this wasn't random. I told my wife to hold on to something and aggressively turned down a side road with my blinker indicating another way. I sped 90 down a road with a much lower speed limit than that, took a few extra turns, and ended up parking in the airport parking lot. I turned off my lights and we waited. That same car came barreling down the road, just absolutely hauling it. Watched him go around a bend out of sight and took off howling in the opposite direction with my lights off using the moonlight only to see. And once I got close to a main road, I flicked the lights on and drove under the speed limit the rest of the way home. It has us both really freaked out. We almost called the cops and parked at the police station so the cops could pull them over instantly. I had no idea what they were doing. But I don't play any games with that kind of stuff. Back when I was 13 years old, I was living in Brooklyn. And this happened about a week or 2 after my birthday. So it must have been sometime at around Easter weekend. A friend of mine went to the movies about once a week. Normally we went to one of several movie theaters in our neighborhood. But there were times when the movie he wanted to see, he always picked the movie. I didn't care what he chose. I love going to the movies, regardless of what we wanted to see wasn't playing in his neighborhood. So we would sometimes go to the theater outside his neighborhood. This time we had to go way out to Manhattan to see the movie. I have long since forgotten the title. And we took a train out to Manhattan, saw the movie, and took the train home. Because we lived in different neighborhoods, we had to get off at different stops. He got off at a stop and I had to continue to the last stop so that I could catch a connecting train to take me home. The subway car that I was sitting in was completely empty. So was the car next to it, which was the first car of the train. After sitting there in the empty car, I don't know what possessed me. But I decided to move to another car instead of sitting there and the empty car. I got up and moved into the next car where there were people. I decided to move even further to another car again, but some leather jacket that guy got in my path and told me that the other train cars were closed. I knew this guy was full of it, but I didn't want any trouble from him. So I just said, "Oh," and turned around and went back into the empty car that I came from and took my old seat. That guy and his friends took my response as a sign of weakness and cowardice, which was I was a meek little 13-year-old who was abused as a kid with no confidence whatsoever. I was sitting there in my seat when a metal dart landed on the floor of my feet, followed by an angry gruff voice yelling, "Pick that up," and looked over to my right, and then leather jacket had guy and his friends around a half dozen or so poured into the car and came straight at me. His dark guy friend was one of the first to reach me as he ordered me to pick up the dart again. I did so, and then he ordered me to hand it to him. I did. Then he proceeded to throw the dart directly into my leg repeatedly. I screamed and cried. I put my hands over my leg in an effort to shield them, but then he ordered me to move my hands away or else I did, and he proceeded to throw his darts into my legs again as he stood over me. My memory is a bit hazy as to how the rest progressed, but I do recall them after the dark throwing. They proceeded to use me as a punching bag, fists flying in my face, chest, and stomach. Not one of them at a time, but several of them at the same time. I managed to break free from those guys, made a run for the car doors so I could escape into the next car where there were people. But one of them was guarding the door. This guy was not taking part in my torture with his friends. He just stood at the door as a lookout. I could sense that this guy had some compassion for me. But he felt some sort of guilt about what was going on, which is why he wasn't taking part that I can recall. But as I reached the door, he still prevented my escape. I yelled, I screamed, I cried. I begged him to let me go. But he wouldn't. He threw me back to his friends. That guy keeping me trapped in that car with his friends. That very second was the worst feeling ever. Somewhere along the line, I found myself on my knees on the floor of the subway car. I reached in my pocket and pulled out all the money I had on me at the time, all the money I had in the world, a single dime. I have adapted them in the palm of my hand above my head and yelled at them that was all I had. Please take it and leave me alone. I felt a leather-gloved hand pressed into my palm and take the dime. But they still weren't finished with me. One of them got the bright idea that he wanted to see my head go crashing through one of the windows of the subway car. So they grabbed me and started to ram me headfirst into the glass of one of the windows. Fortunately, the subway car windows are strong and shatterproof. They had to be due to all the vibrations it takes from the moving train, and later found out. I can't recall how many times they wrapped my head into the glass, somewhere from half a dozen to a dozen before they just gave up. And just before we reached the last stop, I was on my feet. I opened my mouth to say something and accidentally a little spittle came flying out of my mouth and landed on the leather glove of one of my attackers, which earned me a slap in the face. Finally, we reached the last stop. The doors open, and they ran out the car except for one guy who I assumed was their leader. The same guy who at the beginning got on my path and told me the other train cars were closed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and asked me if I needed a couple of bucks. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want anything from him. I refused his offer. And he put his wallet back and walked off the train and went to the front car to report to the conductor that I was attacked. I banged on the door, but there was no one there. I walked off the train onto the platform. I changed platforms. I saw a couple of cops with their backs to me. They were exiting the platform by going down the stairs. I called out to them, but they didn't hear me. I was too weak from the beatings to go run after them. They disappeared out of my sight. It was just as well. I never memorized my attackers' faces, as I try not to make eye contact with them throughout the entire ordeal. I've forgotten what they looked like within seconds of them leaving the train. I could never be able to give an exact positive description, and I never knew their names. Defeated, I caught my connecting train, this time finding and staying in a car that was reasonably filled with normal-looking people. The moment I got home, I flopped in the bed and go to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, my body ached all over. I imagined my attackers, if they're still alive today, are somewhere in their 50s, early 60s. At the time of their attack on me, they were all a few years older than me. So I estimate late teens to early 20s. Some of them no doubt have families of their own, wives, grown kids, homes, good jobs, etc. But I also bet they keep it a secret from everyone in their inner circles, employers, co-workers, friends, and family about the time how they mugged and physically assaulted some young kid, a total stranger, for kicks on the subway train way back when their friends and families' wives and kids probably look up to them thinking they're the greatest, not knowing what low lives they really are and were my life at the time. And the many years following were terrible and painful for many reasons. Granted, they're not to blame for the entire terrible state that was in my rotten life. And to be fair, and I never encountered them, my whole life would still be terrible. But they sure did contribute to the lousy horribleness that is my life. I have never forgotten or forgiven them for the torture they inflicted on me, both physically and mentally. And I hope they all burn in hell. I've worked security on and off for several years to supplement my income. So I've heard quite a few creepy stories from coworkers. Probably the most legitimately scary story I've heard was from a guard that was working in a closed-down arena over spring break. The building is more than 100 years old but has been used since the early 2000s. The city is keeping up with basic maintenance as it waits for a buyer. There's usually one guard assigned to the building. It's a 6,000-seat arena with a huge basement and 2 additional floors that have lots of old office spaces, dressing rooms, and a separate smaller community theater-type stage that's upstairs. The usual guard is doing the rounds through the building. The building itself is very interesting as it's largely unchanged since the heydays of the 70s and 80s. The upper floors are largely dark and pretty creepy, actually. Anyway, the guard is doing his normal rounds, but feels unnaturally creeped out. It says normal post, but something feels just different today. He's feeling jumpy, but shakes it off and continues. He's a very diligent guy. So he walks every floor of the building. He's in the very top of the catwalk system above the main area where the old spotlighting equipment was. It's a narrow wooden catwalk system. And suddenly he hears a loud creak behind him. Like someone's walking. He spins around and sees a guy standing there. The guy is frozen mid-stride, like he's been tiptoeing up behind him. Guy has an unsettling, mischievous-looking smile on his face, like he's been caught with his hand in a cookie jar. Dude has a big steel pipe in his hand instead of a cookie though. The guard pulls his gun and Guy takes off running in the opposite direction and disappears into the labyrinth of the building. The cops came and sweep the building with a canine unit but don't find them. They do find that he's been playing in the dust that's on top of the old concession counters. He had written a bunch of bizarre helter-skelter type unsettling rhymes and drew a bunch of stick figures hanging from nooses. In the speculation is it was some crazy homeless guy that had been hiding in the building a few days and had made a game of following the guards without them knowing it. I saw the writing still on the counters the last time that I was there. I was driving from Pennsylvania to Arizona a few years back for spring break. No hotel stops along the way, just me and two friends taking turns at the wheel for a 35-hour drive. We finally cross the state line and enter Arizona after nearly 2 days of straight driving with minimal stops for food and fuel, etc. It's about 1 a.m. We're running low on gas, and the only gas station for miles that is listed as being open online is located about 3 miles inside of Petrified Forest National Park. We don't have any other options, and we decided to check it out. My friend is driving, another friend is riding passenger in the back seat. They're both women. I'm the only male in the car. Soon as we drive into the park, we're wondering how there's an open gas station in here. It's pitch black. No cars inside the park, is clearly unoccupied. The only source of light on our 3-ish mile drive to our destination was our headlights. Miraculously, we pull up to a gas station buried inside this park. There's no attendant, the store is locked, but the pump is LED. My friend pulls over into tight squeeze, it's a small gas station. And my friend's joke that night should be the one to pump the gas and some of the only man in the car. It's really because none of us wanted to step outside. We're all feeling creeped out by the atmosphere that we've just driven into. I get out the pump, accepts my card, and I start filling up the tank. As soon as I start fueling up, we see lights approaching from the distance. Let me restate that there have been no lights whatsoever, besides our headlights and the faint glow of the gas pump at the station. We could see the blackness of night stretching for miles in this park. There had been nobody on the narrow road with us the whole time that we were driving in. Where were these lights coming from? If we hadn't seen them until the second I exited the car. I say to my friends through the window, must be a park ranger. I realized, as I'm saying this, that I'm verbalizing it to calm myself down rather than because I think it's true. The lights get closer, they're blinding. The high beams are on, shining directly at me as they pull into the station. Eventually, they get close enough that I can make out the vehicle. It's a random RV, not a park ranger. I see a man in the front seat, skinny glasses, mustache, baseball cap to white guy, and that's how I remember him. And there's nobody else in the vehicle with him. I assume that he's going to be in the same boat as US tank, running low, no place to stop for gas, no choice but to fill up the park. But he drives around the unoccupied pump and faces his RV in our direction for no apparent reason. At this point, I can see his eyes we're close enough that I'm looking at the driver clearly as I'm filling up the tank. He smiles at me as he continues to inch his vehicle closer to ours, moving into speed so slow that it was like he was trying to provoke us. He's getting closer and closer. But why isn't he stopping? He's about to hit us while we're immobilized, and he's driving less than 5 miles per hour. So my friend in the passenger seat builds up the courage to reach over and honk the horn to tell him to stop. The sound of that horn, cutting the tension of the absolute silence of the night, will stick with me forever. At this point, I was looking not only at the RV, but also through the window and my friends. Without words, while communicating our extreme horror and confusion at the situation unfolding in front of us. The RV stops just yards away from our car. And the man waves at me again, almost apologetically with a smile, or not fully fueled, but I know that I'm not comfortable standing at the pump any longer. So I hang up and hop back in the car. I don't even have to say, let's get out of here. As soon as I close the door, my friend is already starting to move the car. RV guy has that point position himself in such a way that it is impossible for us to drive straight out of that station because he's blocking our path forward. Our only choice is to reverse into the forests, i.e. the unpaved, non-drivable forest, and angle ourselves out from there. We eventually do it while the RV guy sits there staring at us, still not moving to exit his vehicle or fuel it. We get out, start driving as fast as we can on that narrow path out of the park, and keep checking behind us to see if we're being followed. We weren't, and looked like the RV turned its headlights off as we left. We didn't discuss what had happened until we knew that we weren't 100% safe and back on the highway. When we finally were able to approach the situation, we realized that the RV must have been camped out in the blackness of the forests with its lights out, waiting for someone to approach the pump. We would have seen the headlights otherwise, it would have been too dark not to have noticed them. We have no idea what would have happened if we hadn't honked that horn. If we had let him slowly inching his way closer and hit our car. Would he have said sorry, let's SOG out of the car and check the damage and then tried something on us? What do you have Florida sound to the open, so we didn't have the protection of the car? Was he alone in the RV? We'll never know. And I'm sure glad that we didn't stick around to find out. My grandfather-in-law worked for a private security company as an armed guard for a while in the 1980s. It was a smaller company that mostly loaned out guards for short-term work, things like guarding construction sites, conventions, that kind of thing. Him and one other guard from the company were posted at a department store/mini mall over Easter one that had recently had someone drive a freaking car through one of the atriums and Blues Brothers style. The guards were to patrol the mall and the outside grounds because with the atrium destroyed, they had no real way to lock up the building on account of the huge hole in it. Then I'll put up some boards and such, but it wouldn't have taken much at all to move them and get inside. The mall had a small bank in it as well as a pharmacy and electronic stores. The owners were terrified someone was going to use the damage as an excuse to break in so they contracted armed guards to patrol it and have a normal night watchman who was apparently a real old-timer, just kind of hang out and watch the cameras instead of doing rounds. Easy work, right? Well, the mall closes and my grandpa and his partner show up. They do a walk at the mall, test all the doors, they can make sure what alarms that exists are armed, all the standard stuff. They radio into the watchman that they're going to do once around the outside of the mall to test the doors from the outside and check for anything odd. The watchman radios back in okay, and they head out each going different directions and locking the door behind them. My grandpa was walking along the back of the mall testing service stores and such when his partner yells him over the radio, "The barrier's shredded, there's a huge hole, get here fast." My grandpa takes off in a dead sprint. As he runs, he radios the watchman asking what's going on. He doesn't get a reply. He radios him again, yelling and trying to get them to respond, and there's just silence. He arrives at the barrier with the other guard and sure enough, there's a huge hole just big enough for a person to crawl through that's been shredded out of the plywood. It looks like someone dunked through it with something sharp. My grandpa crouches down and shines his light through the hole, but again, and this is the 80s and flashlights don't exactly cut through the dark like flashlights we have today, so he can't see anything weird inside. He turns to his partner and says that they need to call the police. But this being the 80s, cell phones aren't super common yet. So if they're going to do it, they need to get inside the mall and find a phone. They try radioing the watchman again and still get no reply. They get their guns down, squeezed through the hole, and start advancing toward the security office. Most of the stores have shutters that are down, so it's a pretty straight shot. As they make their way there, they hear an earth-shaking, really loud scream. He said it sounded like a person with a chest the size of a car was just screaming as loudly and as savagely as they could. They both turned towards where the sound came from, which is a grocery store. It's the only store inside the mall that doesn't have a shutter on account of how large it is. They start moving that way because they still can't reach the watchman and are worried whatever screamed may have him. As they get closer, they hear something tearing the place up, just absolutely ripping things apart. They shout that they're security and that they're armed and to come out with your hands up. No sooner than they had yelled, a huge mountain lion threw itself around the corner. Both him and his partner unloaded on the thing, just completely dumped their mags into it. My grandpa said that his partner was so terrified that he almost passed out. The mountain lion was clearly not well as its face was all shredded in the head, a bunch of infected wounds all over it. They guessed that it was probably rabid, so they stayed as far back from it as they could. As soon as the commotion was over, the watchman came on the radio in a panic asking what was happening. The old-timer had fallen asleep at the cameras and missed everything. He said that was the only time in his entire time as a guard that he'd ever had to unholster his sidearm, much less fire it. being stabbed by my now ex-wife over Easter weekend. I went to work and she was fine. But during the day she snapped, mentally didn't know who she was or who I was. I walked in and went to hug her and she had a blank look in her eyes and lunged at me with a carving knife. I turned but she still got me. She was going for the heart and wound up grazing off my ribs under my left arm. I had to grapple with her to get the knife away and stop her from attacking me, and then wound up subduing her face up on the floor with her arms crossed so I could just sit on them. I managed to grab a towel off the counter and put it under my arm to keep from bleeding out, and I was able to dial 911 from my pocket phone. I made sure the dispatch told the cops that I was wounded and was sitting on her to keep her from killing me, that the door was unlocked. California cops burst in, guns drawn, and were threatened to shoot me. I said that I'll get up, but she needs to be controlled or she'll attack them. They tackled me and of course, who jumped up and started to attack them with a cough. They wound up tossing her and cuffing her to alarm bleeding out. They eventually at least grabbed the towel and covered the wound again until the ambulance showed up and cuffed me to the stretcher. They eventually uncovered me, and I had to get stitched up. And I'll never call the cops again. They still tried to arrest me after, but at least the captain had a brain and told the morons to let me go. A doctor told me that a few inches to the left in the stab wound could have killed me. And it never fails to add a creepier or to the whole thing that I dodged death on Easter makes me wonder if something else is really going on in the universe.